I just want to welcome you all to the conference. My name is Maury Wolfson. I'm on the board of directors of ASPO-USA. As I mentioned to the first group, I work for Governor Bill Ritter from Colorado, and at night I work for ASPO-USA. We are very pleased to see you all here. We've got a fantastic lineup of speakers for the conference over the course of the next couple of days. So I just really wanted to welcome you all here and to turn it over to Kyle.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Maury. Well, we have three papers for you today. Three disparate topics, three very interesting topics, three very timely topics. I'll let the authors introduce the papers themselves. We'll start off with Robert Rapier, who is a chemical engineer who has worked in the energy industry his entire career. He recently left the oil industry for a job in the Netherlands where he studies carbon for a living, quote unquote. And he will now present his paper. And we'll ask him to go about 20 minutes, and we'll ask you to save anything other than clarification questions until the end. We're hoping to have 20-25 minutes of good Q&A. So that's the plan, and I will be waving diligently the 5-minute sign. So if you see somebody up here waving a yellow piece of paper at them, that's what I'm doing. Go for it.
Okay, thanks, Kyle. All right, as Kyle said, up until recently, I've worked in the energy industry my entire career. On March 1st, I left the oil industry. I was working in Scotland for ConocoPhillips. This is my first ASPO conference, actually, because they kept me on a little bit of a short leash and discouraged me from coming and speaking because they're afraid I might say some things that might come back to embarrass them. I'm going to discuss a couple of topics at this year's ASPO. The first is about the energy information providers. I'll talk about biofuels on Tuesday. That'll be a little bit more fire and brimstone than this one here. Okay, the outline, what I'm going to talk about. You know, I started writing, or I actually started reading the oil drum because I wanted to know what was going on. And I found after I started posting there a little bit, in some areas I knew what was going on a little bit more than what other people did, so I started writing. The reason was that I know, and I always knew a little bit about the energy information agencies and where to go and get energy statistics. And what I'm going to talk about is what they do well, some examples of some of the information you can go and get from them, and what they don't do so well. So the kind of information you can get from the energy information agencies, if you're looking for any kind of statistical information, how much oil Saudi produced, current gasoline consumption of any state or country, historical gasoline pricing, or if you're looking for very optimistic gasoline or oil price or production forecasts, look no further because you can get that at one of these. The Energy Information Administration. This is where I go and get most of the information that, you know, when I need to go get data, the Energy Information Administration is where I go. I've developed a relationship with some of the employees over time, so even information that I can't quickly go and find publicly, I will email them and get some information. Some of their major products. This week in Petroleum, this is a biggie for me. I read this every week, and until recently, I used to write a post as soon as this thing came out, kind of looking at what's going on in the world of energy. They've got you know, natural gas updates. They've got all kinds of energy outlooks, and there's some very good special reports. For instance, on gasoline pricing, state energy profiles, and country analysis briefs on all the major energy producing countries. This week in Petroleum. This is released at 1 p.m. every Wednesday, except for, you know, there's a holiday on Monday. It'll be delayed by a day. The first report that comes out Wednesday morning, and it's the weekly Petroleum Status Report. And this report has the power to move markets. If you're watching this report and it comes out and there's a big surprise, you can see the futures market spike or decline immediately on the back of this report. The The status report comes out in the morning. This Week in Petroleum is the name of the report that comes out in the afternoon. It's a graphical summary, and they give a little analysis there of what's going on in the world of energy for the week. Now, how do I use the EIA? Here's an example of how I recently used it. I'm on a mailing list for several U.S. senators. This one used to be my senator when I lived in a certain state. I won't identify him, but he sent a note claiming that the basis of his argument was we need to be punishing these oil companies, these dirty oil companies. They are exporting oil at the expense of hardworking Americans. And you know, that claim sounded a bit odd to me, knowing how much oil we export, how much oil we import. So I went to the total crude oil and product exports by destination, EIA report. And what it shows is actual oil, we've only recently exported oil to Canada, and that was a very, very small amount. We import a tremendous amount more oil than that from Canada. Some of the fields that are on the border to Canada, you may see some going into Canada. We do export some gasoline in the border states. Texas sends some into Mexico. Montana, those states send some up into Canada. But most of the oil was petroleum coke, which is a byproduct from the oil industry, and it's something that you know, is a problem for us to get rid of. I'm sure if the senator knows a good market in the U.S., we'd be happy to stop exporting petroleum coke. But this is a claim that was debunked solely by the EIA data. In fact, the barrels of oil equivalent was 1.4 million. I mean, you could go and see exactly where he got his information, or someone in his staff did. But they didn't do their homework very well, and so you go and you look and you see what the truth is, and that's debunked. Sharing information. Topic often comes up, you know, who supplies crude oil to us? Who supplies gasoline to us? From the U.S. crude imports by country of origin, you can see who supplies our oil, or who did in 2007. Some people don't realize that Canada is actually our largest supplier. Up until last year, Mexico was in number 2 spot, but it has slid into number 3, likely to slide on down the list as it looks like they've permanently peaked. Some people are surprised to see that Venezuela, for all the animosity between us and them, is that far up on our list. You know, we're very dependent on them. They're very dependent on us to buy their oil. Reporting. Going into this, this is straight out of This Week in Petroleum. U.S. gasoline stocks. Now you can see. Let's see if I can work this thing. Right here, our gasoline stocks have been very low this late in the season. That blue bar shows where they tend to be in between that bar. Now, if you're going into hurricane season and you're down there on the very bottom of that bar, that indicates if you got a hurricane, you could see some problems in a hurry. So when Hurricane Ike started to come in, I wrote a post on this, and I said, you know, and Gail has written some fine material on this also, that you know, we're in a very precarious position on oil stocks, and you know, that comes straight out of This Week in Petroleum. You go and look, and if we had any kind of supply disruption, we were going to see gasoline prices spiking up, and we're going to see shortages crop up in a hurry, and that's exactly what's happened. And we know that because of that report, This Week in Petroleum, every week. You know, if we'd been in a spot like this, you know, we'd been sitting here going into it, probably wouldn't have seen any price bubbles at all, no outages. Now, here's how I don't use the EIA. They are terrible at price forecasting. Over the last dozen years, they've been wrong consistently. Now, this is a year-on-year basis. Their average error was 53% over the last 12 years. And their best year ever, we're still off 24%. And they're just going back, you know, to see what they were saying just in 2002. That 2002 annual energy outlook was predicting oil prices this year to be $23.11 a barrel.
Oh, it was so close.
Yeah. You can see they fell just short.
That was a typo. We're supposed to be one.
Yeah.
Just like the gas station that didn't have to work.
The same story for supply forecasting. They've been consistently too optimistic. If you go back again to that same 2002 annual energy outlook, they expected 2007 production to be at 88 million barrels per day, and it actually came in at 84.5. And then if you look further out, 2020, they're suggesting that we'll be at almost 120 million barrels a day. The problem is that governments and businesses are making decisions on the basis of these forecasts, and that's the real beef that I have with the EIA over their forecasting. Now this is interesting. This is out of their annual energy outlook for this year, and if you can see what history has shown us is that our imports have been going up, but going forward, suddenly they're going to decline. We're going to reverse the trends that have gone on for the last 30 years, and our imports are suddenly going to drop. Now, for peak oil people, they may say, well, that's actually going to happen because nobody's going to have the oil to send to us. But that's not the basis of their forecast. The basis of their forecast is oil has declined for the last, since the early 70s, but they're forecasting that that's going to turn around now, and we're going to increase production over the next few years. So, you know, I don't put much credibility in these forecasts, but unfortunately, a lot of people do. The IEA, the International Energy Agency, I probably go to that well second most after the EIA. You know, they're an international agency, have 27 member countries, OECD countries. They've got staff from all over those member countries, and they're committed to taking joint action to prevent oil supply disruptions, unlike the EIA, which is just providing data and forecasts. Some of their major products, the one that I always read is the oil market report. They've got various energy outlooks and forecasts as well. They've got some pretty good statistics on renewable energy. If I want to know, you know, how renewable energy is doing in Brazil, I will go to the IEA and find that information out. Special reports on various sectors. Now, how do I use the IEA? The oil market report, if there is a record in oil production for the world, you will read it first right here in the oil market report. This comes out every month, and it is the most current, it has the most current information on worldwide production. It's got the OPEC supply situation. It's got the most up-to-date numbers, except for OPEC themselves. I mean, they do announce, if you want to believe them, what they're actually producing, but the IEA will independently supply that information. It's also the only place I know to go and get world refining margins. If you want to know how well the refining sector is doing in Singapore, I don't know where else to go to get it besides the IEA. Now, this comes out of the oil market report. This is an example. If you look at this is the stock builds. You know, we usually build petroleum stocks in the second quarter. And if you can look in 2008, this is where we were this year. Now, if you're looking at risk going forward, you can say we're sitting at a pretty risky position here, and you get that information by looking at this oil market report. You know, if I was going to bet on prices going forward here, if we got a supply disruption, they're going to go up in a hurry relative to if we were sitting, say, you know, in this area here. And this is, you know, it's the same situation with our gasoline inventories in the U.S. You know, we're sitting at a very, very bad position going into a hurricane. And if another hurricane enters the Gulf anytime soon, you'll see places run out of gas all over the place because we're just sitting so low on inventories. Now, the IEA has been a lot more pessimistic about supply risks. In 2008, they've adopted a very pessimistic tone, and they've sounded a number of warnings. The third one there, oil demand growth surpasses the growth in global oil capacity. This is the one that I termed a couple of years ago peak light. It's a situation where demand is growing faster than supply can grow. And you start to run into a situation where, you know, you just can't get the oil you need, and it leads to the kind of price spikes that we've seen. And the IEA in 2008 has recognized that situation and have warned of impending supply crunches going forward. CERA, Cambridge Energy Research Associates. Yeah, they're an advisor to energy companies, governments, you know, chaired by Daniel Yergin. You guys all know who he is, authored the prize, and they cover all the major energy sectors. their major products, you know, they're an advisor for pay to a lot of the big oil companies. They host CERA Week every year, and I know this year all the major oil companies were there. It's a feel-good get-together about, you know, what oil production is going to look like going forward. Again, one thing they haven't done very well, and this is what they get paid to do, is to forecast prices. If you look at their forecasts since 2002, they've been pretty abysmal. And again, governments and oil companies look to this, and I know within my own companies before, you know, they would point to the CERA forecast. Well, look, they say that oil supplies are going to grow. You can see how far off they've been, especially in 2005, and they're talking about oil prices falling into the $20 range, and in fact, they rose to $65. Their forecasts on oil production, you know, they caveat this by saying this is production capacity. So if we don't actually produce 110 million barrels, they can say, well, we had the capacity to produce it. But the oil prices will say otherwise. I mean, if at $130, $140 a barrel, if you've got the capacity to produce it, you're probably producing it. In 2008, however, they got more pessimistic as well, and they said there is a perception that supply won't keep up with demand. Not that supply won't keep up with demand, but there's a perception, and that creates upward pressure on prices. They also cited new fundamentals, which is, again, demand growing faster than supply can grow to keep up. Now, some of the miscellaneous resources that I use, you know, people ask me, you know, where do you get your ideas for stories? Well, it goes without saying that I read Drumbeat every day in the oil drum, and I often find a story there that I've missed, and that will trigger an idea for a story. But other places that I go, on an annual basis, the BP Statistical Review of World Energy is one of the best comprehensive sources of energy data, and they've got energy across all sectors: coal, oil, natural gas. Oil Price Information Service. When I worked for an oil company, I used to get a brief on this every day, and it was very valuable on tipping you off as to what was going on. In 2007, when gasoline inventories, there was going to be a problem. They forecast that well in advance of there ever being an issue. Platts, I saw somebody with a Platts sticker on here earlier. I read Platts pretty much every day. They have good news headlines and market reports, and I'll stop by there every day. So in summary, the energy information agencies, what they do well is provide data. I mean, you can get any energy related data from one of these agencies. Their forecasting record is very poor, and yet governments continue to have faith in those forecasts. And they need to be called on this, and it needs to be pointed out, and you know, we need to be very careful when governments are making decisions on the basis of these poor forecasts. If they believe that we're going to have 120 million barrels of oil a day 5 years from now, it will greatly impact what we do relative to if we have, you know, 80 5 years from now. That's it. Thanks.
Perfect. Very good. Thank you, Robert. Our second talk for the day is Jeff Vail. Jeff works for the law firm of Davis, Graham & Stubbs in Denver. He's a former Air Force intelligence officer and infrastructure protection analyst for the Department of the Interior. Could you have told me to read this beforehand? He is a graduate of the U.S. Air Force Academy and the University of Denver College of Law, and he will be talking about geopolitics. Take it away, Jeff.
Yes, pretty colors in my slides. Okay, so I'm talking about geopolitics, as Kyle alluded. I think geopolitics is a pretty complex, maybe nebulous topic, difficult just to outline in a very direct fashion. So instead I'm going to try and take a systems thinking approach to it. What I mean by that is I'm going to try to address the complexity and the internal feedback loops that are present in geopolitics as they affect energy directly. So what I'll try and do is start off with quick discussion of some of the issues of why sources of conflict geopolitically and then deal with, going from that, how these sources of conflict really form what I call geopolitical feedback loops that end up disrupting oil production. All right, so the first source of conflict, I think, it's pretty self-explanatory. It's a result of simple economics, and I just simply termed this the rational extraction process. This sets us up for geopolitical problems. As we know, it's well understood that we pursue the easy oil first. We pursue the geologically easy oil, the net energy return easy oil first, but we also pursue the geopolitically easy oil first. For example, you go to the East Texas field before you go to Tupi, or before you go try and drill in the Arctic. You go to Pennsylvania before you go to Nigeria. So the same processes that apply geologically also apply geopolitically. Of course, what this leaves us to is a situation where increasingly going forward, the oil that's left is in geopolitically challenging environments, and especially to the extent that there is geologically or net energy easy oil left, it tends to increasingly be in geopolitically challenging environments. And I think it's important here where we start discussing some of the feedback loop nature here, where it's not just a linear process where the oil happens to be where there's geopolitical problems. It's also, and this is different, the case where increasingly there's geopolitical problems where the oil is. So I think in addition to this rational process of extraction, the character of our energy demand is also something that exacerbates the geopolitical problems that we're facing. So as we pass peak oil, reduction in our oil consumption comes first in the really elastic demand and leaves the more inelastic demand, resulting in a situation where the aggregate demand going forward is increasingly inelastic. This is very important from a geopolitical perspective because it tightens the system. So all actors who are trying to maintain their share of consumption need to go to more extreme measures. More extreme measures to try to ensure that they have the supply coming in to their nation. And I think that kind of going into some of the sources of geopolitical disruption, there's a number of catalysts, but I think that the most important one that I think is underestimated or misunderstood at this point is the conflict between the state and the nation. And if you look at our nation-state system, where in theory you have these two coexistent concepts of the nation, which is the group of people, and the state, the political structure, and you have the nation submits to the sovereignty of the state, and the state in return provides for the needs of the people, provides for the needs of that nation. Well, to the extent that they overlap perfectly, this actually works out fairly well in theory, but of course that never really happened. There never really was this perfect overlap, even though some people try to suggest that there was. But especially in post-colonial environments, in the modern environment where we're really globally networked and there's a lot less allegiance to an individual state, these things start to really spread apart. And to the extent that the desires of the state and the needs or demands of the nation are no longer exactly the same, this is a source of conflict. So look, for example, to Nigeria. Take a villager in the Ija Delta region of Nigeria, who all he knows is he lives in a jungle delta where his family and his people have lived for as long as anyone can remember, and the oil is coming from his territory. He's not that concerned that 100 years ago the British amalgamated 250 separate ethnic groups into a state called Nigeria, and that this state now takes all those oil reserves, oil revenues rather, centralizes them and uses them to pay for all the problems of Nigerians everywhere. He just sees that he's not getting much for all this oil taken from his land. And so this is a pretty clear source of conflict. Beyond just nation and state, however, there's also a source of conflict between states and non-state groups of all types, whether this is ethnic minorities, whether this is religious sects, whether it's affinity groups, and these things can be increasingly in the modern era, they don't have to be geologically or geographically tied to an individual location. They can be affinity groups that are connected via the internet or ideologically from all around the world. Also disputes between legal owners and moral owners. Back to our Nigerian villager, he might see himself as the moral owner of the oil. The Nigerian state might disagree with the legal weight that moral ownership carries. So I think that all these things come together under what I call mutually exclusive overlap. If the minimum requirements of Group A and Group B can't be met simultaneously, then you get to this situation where both sides dig in. This exacerbates the conflict, tends to lead to the escalation of the conflict, more likely to use violence rather than try to seek a political solution to the conflict. We're certainly seeing this right now, not just in Nigeria, but in places like Iraq, where even though we may be able to suppress some of the violence, we really haven't dealt with this fundamental problem that there's at least 3 major groups who have mutually exclusive minimum demands, and we haven't figured out how to sort that out. And until that gets resolved, you're really just pushing off an inevitable conflict. So in a world with dwindling energy resources, this really forces actors to take tough choices. Do you accept reduced supply for yourself, or do you fight to maintain your current share of the supply? And it really boils down to a resource insecurity issue. So if one consumer seeks to maintain their absolute consumption in an environment of dwindling supplies, who is it that's going to give up more than their share of decrease to make that possible? There's a variety of mechanisms for this. One is pipeline mercantilism. I think in general, this whole concept really falls under a notion of a revival of the old economic philosophy of mercantilism, where I think that there's this notion that oil and natural gas are these purely fungible commodities. But in reality, things like pipelines and other infrastructure assets really do introduce at least an element of fixedness into the direction of these resource flows. So a lot of nations and actors are trying to influence the direction that this infrastructure points resources to ensure that they get their share. Also, long-term bilateral supply contracts, oftentimes merged with developmental aid or other kinds of loans. This is a favorite now of China and India, trying to ensure long-term energy supplies. And of course, if that fails, there's military adventurism. I think increasingly this is already in the headlines. You really can't miss it. Iraq, the recent conflict in Georgia, other actions by Russia. But I think as scarcity increases, this will continue and spread to other areas that many of us in this room might have heard of, but that really aren't in the headlines right now. Places like the Spratly Islands, the Ogaden province of Ethiopia, or North Africa and the recent Russian influence there, or what I think is really one of the dark horses in the room, which is the Arctic. Lots of very peace-loving and rule-of-law-abiding Western nations really setting themselves up for a pretty serious conflict over who owns resources in the Arctic. And I think all of this, in a sense, the nation-state conflict, the issues of mercantilism, their insecurity, they're all really issues that come from a changing military landscape, a shift in power relationships, and a democratization of the means of violence, away from the traditional model where the state had at least a theoretical monopoly on the use of violence, to a current model where really now anyone who has access to the internet can fairly effectively have access to the means of violence. Especially, and I think this evolution in military tactics deals with a number of areas, spreading understanding of targeting methodology, the realization that the return on investment targeting energy infrastructure can be very high and gets higher as energy prices get higher, and also a network innovation as far as the structure of how many of these non-state adversaries are structured that makes the state's job of counterinsurgency that much more difficult, something that we're of course seeing right now in Iraq and in Afghanistan. So what happens is simultaneously you have this situation where disenfranchised groups of all stripes have an improved ability to challenge the established power structures militarily, and a situation where the increasingly desired and effective way of doing that is by directly disrupting energy infrastructure, energy flows, resource production, that kind of thing. This really isn't new. This graphic actually looks back to a tactic used by the Scythians against Alexander the Great, a swarming tactic, but it's exactly the kind of thing that's finding new ground in modern application in energy, in insurgency, that kind of thing. And these military developments, I think that they really close the circle, and they take what otherwise would be just a discrete set of catalysts for geopolitical conflict, and they turn them into a series of geopolitical positive feedback loops that I think really are beginning to cause some significant disruptions in global energy supply. Now, all of these developments do act as positive feedback loops. That is, they're driven by scarcity. But when they remove oil from the market, when they increase scarcity, they then increase the catalyst for themselves as well. And I think that these phenomena together, they're not discrete. They do form a system that will only grow more intense as scarcity increases, as we pass further beyond peak oil, further beyond peak energy. So I think this is kind of the dramatic graphic that everyone likes to see. The right side, the bottom line here is the right side of civilization's oil production curve won't look like the left. Now, this is a step beyond the already fairly dramatic proposition of peak oil, which is that the right side might look as bad as the left, just in mirror image. What I'm suggesting is when you incorporate the impact of geopolitical disruptions, the right side will actually look worse than the left side. Is that an over-dramatization? Answer, I don't think so. I think that if peak oil is a problem, then geopolitical feedback loops will make it worse. Now, admittedly, if we find a suitable energy substitute to continue fueling global economic growth, global population growth indefinitely, then neither peak oil nor geopolitical feedback loops will really be a substantial challenge to mankind. But the danger presented by geopolitical feedback loops, in my opinion, is that while we might understand the geological, the economic nature of peak oil, if we fail to incorporate and realize that geopolitical impacts are an inseparable part of this entire system, I think we'll underestimate the long-term effect. So where on this curve are we now? As in this room, I'm sure everyone's well aware, there's a pretty legitimate debate about the exact timing of peak oil. And a debate not only on timing, but also on the very existence of peak energy. But I think the key thing from a geopolitical perspective is it's not the date of peak that begins to really set up these positive feedback loops to begin operating. Rather, I think it's the point, I'd say it's probably right about there on this unlabeled, undated graph. It's the point where the supply increase shifts from accelerating supply increase to decelerating supply increase. And I think I doubt I could find any person in this room who would argue that we have not already passed that point. Because at that point now, scarcity is increasing, elasticity is decreasing, and these geopolitical feedback loops begin to ramp up. The other question I often get is, what about this sharp cliff on the right-hand side? Shouldn't the geopolitically determined decline in oil production mirror this kind of gradual tailing off of geologically driven peak oil? I think the answer is not necessarily. It's entirely possible, while I don't think anyone's going to argue we're going to strictly run out of oil. We'll never get the last barrel out of the ground. But it is possible that we run out of the necessary geopolitical environment, the necessary level of economic complexity needed to go through the really very complex task of producing, exporting, importing, refining petroleum products, other resources. So I think it is possible that while this may never hit zero, that this could be a very sharp drop-off, not just a gradual tailing off as we're used to seeing when dealing with geological phenomena. I think it's also tempting to think of these phenomena as a bunch of conceptually and geographically separate, disparate systems. But I think that really, in truth, it is a global feedback system. You look at the conflict in Nigeria, for example, increasing scarcity, that drives targeting choices in Mexico. Then when you see these rebels in Mexico targeting Mexican gas pipelines, that increases scarcity, which in turn, again, increases the catalyst for conflict in Nigeria. So I think this is a critical concept because events in regions that are clearly out of control, take Nigeria, for example, are substantially impacting the geopolitical situation in what a few years ago were considered extremely stable environments. Take, for example, Scotland, Canada, places like that. I probably would have been laughed out of the room for even saying Scotland recently, and I'm not suggesting that we're going to have a bunch of Picts and Scots with bucklers and swords charging on York. But I don't think anyone in this room can deny that increased scarcity from events in Nigeria are exacerbating the admittedly already simmering tensions that exist in Scotland right now. I think it's also a temptation to think of geopolitical problems as a group of discretely solvable problems, where you can just solve one in isolation, another in isolation. And all that's really needed is a good dose of good governance or a bit more democracy, something like that. I think this is probably true, to an extent, in an environment of decreasing scarcity. But it's probably not true now that we've transitioned into an environment of increasing scarcity. So addressing geopolitical symptoms then often leads to alternative negative outcomes. Take Nigeria, for example, where their corruption and failure to distribute oil wealth effectively to their people inflames the ethnic conflict, the sectarian conflict that's already existing there. But it also keeps Nigerian people in abject poverty. I'm not suggesting in any way that that's a good thing, but if we solve the problem of Nigerian governance and properly distribute those revenues to the Nigerian people, well, you might effectively diffuse the existing conflict in the Delta region. What you might see in addition is a dramatic increase in domestic consumption in Nigeria. So from a human rights perspective, from a good governance perspective, the choice is clear. You try and solve that problem. But it's a mistake to think that in solving that problem, we're actually resolving the issue of, or improving the issue of global energy supplies. So I think that this notion of solving this geopolitical threat to energy resources really requires a far more radical restructuring than most people assume. The global economy, as a notion predicated on perpetual growth and relying on a finite resource to fuel that perpetual growth, just is a simple disconnect. And I think we all understand that. But the ways of solving that, I think, are really quite radical. I don't know if they're in any way realistic. For example, potentially radical decentralization of energy sources, or a transition to truly renewable energy resources, reliance on vernacular modes or levels of consumption. These kinds of things, they may potentially be able to actually resolve these geopolitical tensions, but this solution requires such a radical restructuring that I think it would just be foolish to think that it's in any way realistic that we would proactively choose and then implement such a course. Instead, I think it's really the more pragmatic approach is that we should treat geopolitics much the way we treat geology, as a force of nature that will cause a problem, and we, rather than trying to solve it, you don't try and solve geology. You don't go out there and say, well, the reservoir is half empty, let's solve it by making it not half empty. Same thing with geopolitics. I think that we have to treat it as a force of nature. So regardless of whether you think these problems are solvable or not, I think this is the key takeaway. I think that our energy future is not controlled solely by what's economically possible, what's technologically possible, what's geologically possible, but it's also influenced a lot by the much less concrete limiting factor of what's geopolitically possible. I think that reality will always be that we can always produce less in reality, under geopolitical reality, than is economically feasible, than is technologically feasible, and then is geologically feasible. How much less, I really don't know, but my personal opinion is it will be significantly less and increasingly less as time goes forward. And I think that the key here is that if you aren't planning for that level of uncertainty beyond what we already realize in geological, economic, technological uncertainty, then I think you're really not prepared for what's coming up. That's it.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you. Our last talk this afternoon is by Brian Mashoff. Brian is a scientist technologist who writes on energy issues on the oil drum and is on his own blog, Satellite Over the Desert, under the name Joules Burn. He's having a coming out party today. He has a PhD in chemistry from the University of Arizona and resides in Seattle. Take it away, Brian.
With apologies to Kyle and Robert, if you follow a lawyer, you at least have to wear a tie. Okay, I don't get out of some. Oh my God. This sort of sets the tone. Beyond this, I flew in on Southwest Airlines today, and in the in-flight magazine, they had an advertisement by an oil company out of Texas, and it's called Alaska, the Solution to America's Energy Crisis. It's Bald Eagle Energy holds the key to U.S. energy independence. And such great prose as, fortunately, emerging domestic oil and gas companies such as Texas-based Bald Eagle Energy Incorporated hold the key to restoring America to its rightful place as the land of the free and the home of the brave. But they talk about, something that caught my eye is just thinking about the magnitude that they're talking about. It right now from the North Slope, it gives a figure of $781,000 barrels a day, and I was thinking about that term in reference to what comes out of Saudi Arabia, and even though that would be our oil up in Alaska, the part of the problem is that in the global energy scheme, the global oil scheme, the fortunes of Saudi Arabia have a lot more to do with what's going to happen than what happens in Alaska, because a depletion or a further decay of what comes out of Saudi Arabia, just because of the magnitude of what's coming out right now, is pretty large compared to what can come out of Alaska in any reasonable expectation. First, to give a couple of terms, thinking about some of these words, like what does maintenance mean in the context of keeping oil flowing from a reservoir? And it is, you're active maintaining, you are upkeeping an oil field, but what are we maintaining? Well, we're maintaining production, but of course production is extraction and depletion. So it's always important to keep that into account, because the word production really makes it seem like you're producing something. You're making it, but you're not making it. You're extracting it, and it's going to be gone at some point. And it's worth at least being honest about it. So what do you do in terms of infrastructure that's there? How do you maintain a production from an oil field, where you put oil wells places where there hasn't been one before? In the case of Saudi Arabia, where you're doing a water sweep on the field, you try to you move your wells further in toward the center of the field where the dry oil is still behind, or if you've left oil in particular zones out further to the periphery, well, you can maybe tap into those a little bit with more wells. You can also go back to existing wells. You can stimulate them, or you can drill sidetracks off them. And you can work on the water injection infrastructure to try to keep up the pressure, and that gets to be a problem when you get to the center of the field, because your original injectors are way out here. So food for thought. There's a lot of talk about from Saudi Arabia and Saudi Aramco about their mega projects and how much that's going to deliver, and they keep on re-announcing it to just keep reminding us that it's coming. But what about the existing production that they don't talk about as much? And that's what sort of got me into this. Is all these incredible resources out there, and it's just like this black box that oil comes out of, and we're happy about it. These are the mega projects listed, and a lot of these have come to pass. Some of these are kind of iffy, and they sort of get started, but then they don't. And then we have the ones over here which are going to supposedly come on, but they're going to be delayed as well. And so you never know what's going to come. This is actually from an anonymous source in terms of what they predict to be their capacity in 2009. And I'm not going to dwell too much on the numbers because there's some flaky things about it, but you can basically see that Gawar is still a big chunk of it, and Safanaya and et cetera. A lot of heavy oil in the upper regions of what they call their capacity. So when you see numbers that they talk about their capacity, there's a lot of inflated numbers on the heavy oil side. For those, just a quick reference of where some of the fields are. I don't want to point everything out, so we'll just kind of move on. Well, it is sort of a special kind of madness. I think you could really come up with answers, sitting in your chair at home. And also to, classify and quantify what's going on and come up with some kind of numbers. And also do it on a very paltry budget. And maybe even measure the oil flowing out of the wells. Wouldn't that be good? And make lots of money doing this. That would be even better. Well, yes, we can do that, and we can do that, and we can do that if time doesn't equal money. But oil flowing from the wells is a bit more of a challenge, but I think there actually might be a way to get some kind of information from satellites. And I'm not really making a lot of money doing that yet. The method, I haven't seen the stuff that I presented on the web, looking at Google Earth images, high resolution from the Digital Globe satellite, which is floating overhead, or the QuickBird satellite. So I find the wells and I count them, and then in certain cases I can align and compare the imagery from various sources, or compare the imagery that I see with dated maps of existing or pre-existing oil field infrastructure, such as well maps. And so, okay, these wells were there at this point, and I can look at see what's happened since then. A lot of the SPE publications are out there that have things on that, as Matt Simmons has talked a lot about. But they usually don't identify the fields necessarily by name. Sometimes it's kind of an interesting game to try to figure out what they're actually talking about. And some of the easy questions. Oh, this was a real tough one. Tar is present in several zones and 2 carbonate reservoirs, G and Q, in Saudi Arabia, and it wasn't too hard to figure out which 2 fields they were talking about. But you get a little bit harder down at the bottom, a major Arabian carbonate reservoir. But weeding your way through the paper, you usually figure out what it is after a while. And sometimes, just by after staring at enough satellite images, I can figure out what's going on. This was actually in a presentation for SPE Distinguished Lecture Series. And I don't know if in the talk he identified what it was, but in the particular slide, it was just an onshore carbonate reservoir. And this turns out to be the Harod 2 increment in the Harod redevelopment in Gawar. I'll be coming back to that later. Here's the Google Earth application for those of you who haven't seen it, which I'll just kind of move on here. The most important thing to figure out in Saudi Arabia is what you're looking at. There's lots of sand and lots of open space. You're not really blocked by trees for the most part. But there are two. But there is one complicating fact in that they've drilled a lot of gas wells, and so it gets confusing when you first look at it because you see a lot of these really huge-looking structures or platforms out there for something. And after a while, you can identify them as gas wells because all the pipelines all lead to the gas plants instead of to gas oil separating plants. On the left, we have a couple oil wells, a more recent one down to the left and a older one up to the right. And the difference between these is really the amount of space necessary probably to store all the drilling equipment, probably for deeper wells possibly. But in any event, the space that they grade out is a little bit broader. What I'm going to do next is just basically go through a few slides that show how you can actually make one of these oil wells just from looking at the satellite. And first, you bring in a lot of heavy equipment and start pushing a lot of sand all over the place. And eventually, you carve out a nice looking space that looks like that. It's about 50 meters or so square for the main area there, for the big square area. And then it starts filling up with all kinds of equipment. These are obviously different places since I couldn't really follow particular one over time. And so you can see the big blotch in there. There's the drilling rig going up. And we start filling up the reserve pits with a lot of drilling mud. And pretty much then we're pretty well done and everything starts getting hauled away. I was actually kind of fortuitously came across two different images after they made an update showing the same well 3 years apart. One they were drilling it, and then one after the dust had settled and they'd mostly cleaned up what was going on. This well has been kind of abandoned after a few years, and you can usually tell that they've kind of removed everything, but they don't really do that too often. And in some cases, you can see a whole bunch of different things going on one particular year. This is in year 2006 in Hawaii, and there's some gas drilling going on and some oil wells being drilled and a few other old sites as well. And this is just a particular shot from a well that was being done in the center of Uthmania. And the perimeter around these fields, you can kind of generally see there's a bunch of these places where the dirt has basically been pushed up. And I'm not quite sure why they do that, whether it's to basically block out some of the sand from blowing in or to contain things if things get out of control. I don't really know. But it's very interesting to look at this photo after seeing the other images from taken way up in the satellite. So in terms of thinking about maintenance, I think instead of you take your car in for lube and maybe some fluids, but when you're talking about something on this scale, it's more like a major overhaul. It's been pumping out a lot of oil for 40 years, and really the bulk of what was been coming out of Saudi Arabia during that time. And what I was able to do is looking at a combination of a few different maps, figure out what has been going on basically this decade in terms of new wells being drilled. So on the left we have the wells that basically were drilled before the turn of this decade, turn of the century. And you can see the water injection wells in blue going around the side and all the red producer wells in the inside. And on the right-hand side, I have basically the newer wells, as well as some of the drilling rigs that are indicated by the diamond shapes. So the image on both the satellite images were taken in 2006, kind of in the summer. And you can generally see definitely see what's going on here is that You know, the older wells were drilled out here and the new wells are drilled in here. And that's all fine and dandy, but there's a couple of things that are really important about this. Number one, it's the relative number of the wells that have been added relative to what has been there before. Not the absolute number, because they'll always claim that, well, look, Texas has, you know, a gazillion wells, and so Saudi Arabia only has this many. But you remember that Saudi Arabia wells produce this much. So when you replace a whole bunch of wells, let's say about 400, as you can kind of count on the side there, in the span of a decade or so, you're replacing someplace between 1 to 4 million barrels of production of what was there before. And that's okay if you can keep doing that, but if you really run out of space to drill more wells, you really can't do that. So it's indicating of how much further can it go just based on looking at this. Focusing on a couple of different areas in Ayandar and in Shedgum, I was able to find a few examples scattered in various publications where they showed how much oil is left in particular areas. So they're showing an oil thickness. And their color coding scheme kind of goes from yellow, which basically the original thickness of the oil column, going down to through the pink and into the blue. And this is in the north part of this part of Gawar. And the outline in red is a gas cap, which was formed when they injected gas in the well to keep the pressure up early on. The open green circles are the ones where there are wells going in at that particular time. They're either waiting for drilling rig to come along. The other green circles with a black dot in it are ones that have been done over this decade, for example. And then again, the drilling rigs. So you can see we have a couple drilling rigs up in this region. But the key thing here is that we've really squeezed in on the gas cap in terms of what's there. And once you get to that point, then there's not a lot, there's not a whole lot, there's a lot less oil than you think because of the presence of that gas cap. I was able to look at some of what's going on in the south as well. And this is looking at two different areas, one over in Shedgum and one map that's in the south part of Ayandar. And you can see a pretty good correlation of where they have been drilling the wells and where they're drilling the wells based on what is shown on these columns here. So we can somewhat extrapolate to the other parts of the fields if you can sort of guide your eye along where you think the lines might connect, see how much is left. What's that? Well, you could kind of visualize a line going through there and say, okay, well, that's about where that's constrained, and we're going this way. And if you believe that where they're drilling is up there is also representative of how much oil is left up there. There's some other oil thickness maps that I have which sort of indicate that's basically what's going on too. We move along to a different case, and this is interesting because the southern portion of Gawar was shut off for a number of years in the 80s and then restarted, but it didn't really kick in until 1996 when they put in the northernmost segment of Harod, and then the Harod 2 increment came on in about 2003. And so I have shown there the map that I found in that presentation superimposed on it, and the wells really do line up when you find them. But it's only been at the point of this the satellite data here was taken. It had only gone 3 years, and as David pointed out this morning, or not this morning, but earlier this afternoon in the talk. This was put in with horizontal wells, and so you think about is there an issue or is there a possible issue with faster breakthrough of these wells, and could that be spotted by looking for new development? I'm backing up a few years here. Let me toss back here for a second. What I didn't show on the Harod map is they've numbered a lot of the oil wells. In fact, they've numbered all of them that are in that diagram, as well as some of the gas wells. And in combination of that with other maps, you can really tell where the oil wells have been put in over time. And in this case, this is going back to the very beginning of 1952 when they first started with the first wells that go in, number 1, 2. You can see how they went this way across the field and then came across this way. this was from a map that dates to 1971 that shows these wells present. And then in 1989, just before things really got kicking into gear, this is what was there. So they hadn't really gone into any kind of a water injection scheme around the periphery. And this is showing in 2002 in this particular region of this field. I've shown them putting in the water injectors first, and these have a numbering sequence of starting in the 700s. But so they just see where they go, and then the ones going into the horizontal wells that they put in, the producers, going into the center of the field. So it's a little bit crowded showing all the numbers. I'll take the numbers away in a second. But you can see where the old vertical wells were, and they're still there and still connected up, so they're probably producing. But also the number of new wells that have been put in. Okay, now I've took away the numbers, and the open green circles represent sites that in 2006 were being prepared for drilling. Some of them already were connected up. There's one drilling rig present there drilling for oil, and there are one thing of note that I don't know if this thing has this work down here. Probably not. This line right here marks a point where the the representation on Google Earth it's 2006 right here, 2007 right here, and 2004 down here. So if you can see a rather disparity in the number of newer sites down here versus up here, it's because this is 2004. So it sort of indicates that there's actually a lot that's going on here. And it should be noted that this is the same time that all that drilling was going on up in the north part of Gawar, as well as getting started with drilling in Karai and the AFK increment as well. So there's some impetus for putting a lot of resources into maintaining production in even the fairly recently updated parts of the Saudi Arabia infrastructure. Sort of the diagnosis here is that older production is being replaced daily. There is definitely need for them to invest a lot of money and a lot of time into keeping their existing production going. But the problem is they're running out of dry rock to do that in. There is a lot of oil to be sure, but after they go through that cycle of the mega projects, there really isn't a lot that they can do that's left. I mean, there's no big project they can point to and says this is really going to be it big. It's going to have to be a combination of a lot of smaller fields. I have enough slides for a whole nother talk, so I could go on forever, but it's sort of up to Kyle.
Put to sleep. I guess we go around and just with the mic and have questions. Is that what we do? I'm just looking for somebody to affirm that. Okay. Here you go.
Thank you. And this is almost certainly the best information I've ever been able to get in a double-wide trailer. Jeff, how concerned is the U.S. military about peak oil, both as a cause of war and as an added expense to training and prosecuting war?
You can come up here if you want.
I think there's a pretty significant lack of concern, lack of comprehension of the big picture problem, the big picture of peak oil and the long-term kind of grinding descent. There's a lot of concern and a lot of action right now going on about how to deal with current high energy prices and how to deal with the potential for less availability of oil. I mean, if you look at how much oil like an M1A1 Abrams tank uses in a minute, it's mind-blowing. Air Force also uses amazing amounts. I know there's lots of projects right now dealing with ways to try to reduce energy use. A good friend of mine actually is working at the Pentagon. He's a scientific analyst trying to analyze the energy cost of taking out a target with unmanned drone versus with a manned drone, not because the two planes necessarily take that much different amounts of fuel, but because of the forward footprint needed to deploy for all the people to support a manned aircraft, as opposed to a much smaller forward footprint and a much larger reachback footprint for a drone. So I know they're very closely watching it, but I don't think that they're adequately understanding the magnitude of the long-term problem.
Thank you.
Yep.
He wanted to go right there. Get him right there.
For now, a simple question. What is dry rock?
Dry rock, of course, is a misnomer because the rock has a certain amount of water in it to begin with. But I'm referring to the original oil-water proportionation in the original rock, the original reservoir before they started pumping water into it and taking the oil out.
Gail's got the mic back there, so raise your hand and if anybody has anything. Here's one up here, Gail.
I could just.
Yeah.
Let's see, this is probably for Jeff.
Can you turn it on?
Is it on now?
Yeah.
Great. For Jeff.
Okay.
Talk right into it, maybe.
Can you just talk right? Talk to the top. Talk to the top.
Okay, you got it. I'll just, okay. My learning curve is slow. Nobody talks about growing population. In some countries, growing faster, others. That's clearly a factor. Like if our population were 10 million or 100 million smaller, we wouldn't have so much problem. What kind of geopolitical pressures might come up? Like China is going to have a fairly stable population. India is the population is going to explode.
Yeah, I think it's an issue of scarcity per person, or energy supply available per person. So I think that much the way, if you have your nation and your state model where the state no longer can meet the needs of the nation because energy is becoming too scarce, exact same thing happens if population is becoming too big. Nigeria, for example, has amazing resources, but even if they distributed it very equitably, it simply is not enough to go around because that country is already so populous and is growing so rapidly.
Talking about it again.
I'm not sure there are any good solutions to that problem, just like there are not necessarily any good, I mean, there are very obvious solutions, but actually implementable solutions, that's probably a different story.
Can I ask two quick ones? One to Robert and one to Brian. Robert, you didn't include the USGS. Is that just worthless? I mean, that's my view of it.
Yeah, it is, in my opinion, pretty worthless. I mean, but you know, so are, in my opinion, like the forecasts of the EIA. I think they're pretty worthless.
We have a poster downstairs on testing USGS estimates.
And a quick one for Brian. How much oil do you think's left in Saudi Arabia?
This much. I've kind of avoided putting numbers on it, mostly because there's a lot of uncertainty. I mean, even from the data I've been able to figure out, there's a lot of uncertainty about what the oil-water ratio, the initial oil-water ratio. So how much, trying to estimate how much is in the reservoir. I can come up with a much better estimate on the aerial size of the reservoir, I think, by virtue of this data. But I can only go by what they've put out there in terms of the thicknesses and stuff, and looking at how much is coming out. So, the piece that I'm going for is basically, what are they acting like? Where are they drilling? I think there's information there.
This is just a comment or a response to the question about population. There's actually a very good overview of population, water supply, peak oil, climate change in Lester Brown's book, Plan B 3.0, which is also available from their website for free. You can download it. It's also translated into many languages. So it does at least a first cut of what a comprehensive solution might be if you could get the political forces to agree enough to try to implement it.
Would you restate that?
It's, if you just search Lester Brown Plan B 3.0. It's his third version of the attempt to put together a comprehensive solution to all of the problems simultaneously, along with poverty. Poverty reduction is, of course, a critical component. Education of women, of course, is a key component for population control.
Charlotte, I have a geopolitical question. We have countries that are exporting oil and countries that are importing oil. And at some point, the exporting countries must start to think who should export oil to us when we cannot export oil ourselves. And we have one example now, Indonesia, that went from being an oil exporting country to an oil importing country. And my question is, when do you think Russia realized that we cannot export oil because we need it in Russia?
I think Russia is one of the rare examples where they actually have population working in their favor, since it seems to be shrinking rather dramatically. But yeah, I think that, there you go. I think that this net export problem is definitely a key component of this geopolitics. And it's actually, I've intentionally avoided it, not because I don't think it's important. It's probably actually the most single important issue in the short term, but because I think it's been best covered by others elsewhere. Jeffrey Brown, for example, has written extensively on that at the Oil Drum. So,
well, I'd like to ask a question on that, because what about the countries of the former Soviet Union that surround it? I mean, have they, by virtue of dissolving the Soviet Union, have they essentially, bought themselves a little bit of buffer because they, surrounding regions growing more than they were? Is that?
I don't know if they bought themselves any buffer. I think that they've more opened a can of worms in the process. And I think that it's just a case where Russia now really wants to exert a bit more control over where that oil goes, where that natural gas goes. Sorry. I'm done anyway.
Brazil, it was recently announced that Brazil had discovered 2 large fields. How large are those fields? Does anybody know?
8 billion.
For
yeah,
the combination of the both?
They're a combination of that, we don't know how big they are, plus they're incredibly deep, incredibly hard to get at, below the salt. I mean, it's very, it's just like the Alaska situation. People get very excited about something that they don't, that they don't know a whole lot about. And it's that bias to wanting to believe that there's something out there.
Good for Brazil, of course.
It's going to be great for Brazil.
I have a question for you all that I'd just like to hear your thoughts about what I would call peak water. Lester Brown's book. Lester Brown does a fabulous job of painting the picture of global issues all colliding, climate change and water and energy and population, and it's a lot. But I guess I just came from a lecture in which they were talking about water, and it just seems to me like in your geopolitical talk, you could have substituted the word water for conflict the same as the word energy. And so just, can you share any thoughts you have about that?
Yeah, actually, interestingly, the section of Interior that I worked for was reclamation, which is very interested in the water picture. They have most of the large dams in the West. I think you really can substitute water in some circumstances to wherever there was oil in that presentation. I think that it's a bit more fundamentally renewable, and it's much more tied into the mode of consumption, the population issues, these kinds of things, but probably arguably even less substitutable than oil. What do you use instead of water? Kool-Aid.
Yeah, hi. I came in a little bit late. I don't know if you'd already discussed it or not. We're talking about the water injection ratio in Saudi Arabia.
Mm-hmm.
Michael Rupert used to say in 04, 05 that they were already going over 40%. And I was wondering what your figures are on that.
Yeah, I think in general it's not really. You can make too much about those kind of numbers and those kind of projections of what's happening, because when they start drilling a bunch of wells in the middle of the field, and essentially replacing wells that are out here that have a high water cut, by virtue of doing that, you're going to have a lower water cut, And if you just look at that thing in particular, it sounds great. Yeah, we've lowered our water cut and it's gone down, but there's a reason that's happened, and that's another thing that can't go on. I mean, there's not a when you run out of that space in the middle of the field that where the water flood hasn't reached yet, then what do you do? So it's the maintenance question. You're not really maintaining it. You're basically postponing the end of the time when you're going to really run out of field.
I recently spoke with Professor Paul Stevens, who was running around in Washington explaining everybody that we are peaking, but not in peak oil, but in production. And we need trillions investment, and the problem is not peak oil, but production peak. Actually, at the same time, we hear here peak oil. And he explained to me what all these peak oil people are wrong about is they only look at conventional oil, not at non-conventional sources like the North Sea. I was a bit I couldn't understand what he meant. The North Sea, isn't that included? So what is the non-conventional part of it?
Well, non-conventional is stuff like the Alberta, oil sands. It's the, it's a shale. That's stuff they're trying to get in the North Dakota. It is in terms of a hydrocarbon resource, it's very large. But the fundamental problem is, what does it take to get that out, and how dispersed is it?
And that's been my question, is why aren't the politicians being honest? And I guess that's kind of an oxymoron in and of itself.
I wouldn't say they're not being honest. I think we impugn politicians' motives way too much as it is, because they're dealing with what's in front of them. Because think about it, a member of the House of Representatives runs for re-election every 2 years. What are they concerned about? Those 2 years. I mean, that's completely rational behavior on their part. And so when you think about the long-term energy situation compared to that 2 years, yeah, what do you expect? I mean, it's a whole bunch of different motivations and rationales playing against each other. And the only way you can get around that is either by public momentum, changes in mores, changes in values, or massive centralization. Those are your choices. I'm sorry? But governing the commons, right? I mean, the whole idea, taking Garrett Hardin, if you look at Ostrom, who talks about governing the commons, you do it one of two ways. You either change values, change mores, or you centralize and control the resources. Those are your choices.
And the old companies, what's their interest to deny this?
Well, exactly. Actors have been behaving rationally by a profit motive for a very long time. Economic growth needs to be facilitated. It's usually facilitated by governance, right? I mean, it's all rational. It's all, and that's the problem, is that you're almost asking for irrational courses.
And Bill Bennett had a guest on this morning that said we need 5% growth per annum to get our way out of this problem.
We're the new China. Is that what you're saying?
Let me try and give you a perspective from somebody that's new to the oil industry. I started investigating and reading about peak oil 40 months ago. And I've been reading it full time. And I've come to some conclusions. I was fortunate enough to have breakfast with Charles this morning. Right, Charles?
Put the mic a little closer.
Okay.
Eat the mic. Eat the mic. Eat the mic.
It is clear to me, I come to a meeting like this and we all sit around and we all say, yeah, we're right, peak oil is really good, but nobody really knows that story. I think I'm telling you something you already know. Yeah. I gave a talk not too long ago and I said, I got a prize for anybody that knows what peak oil is. About 300 people. 5 people put up their hand in an energy conference in Santa Barbara.
Well, I think if you took a random person time.
Okay, but I've watched one individual make a difference, not for peak oil, but for big oil. Daniel Yergin, by himself, singularly, has gone and captured Washington, the oil companies. His people are invited to the testimonials in Congress. And I follow all of that. I listen to all of that. And we have one voice in Washington, Roscoe Bartlett.
Yeah.
And I've never met the man, but he's the wrong messenger. He is the wrong messenger. I'm trying through one of our congresswomen in Santa Barbara to make a difference. I've written an article about what our energy policy should be for the United States. She read it, she thought it was good, and she's going to try to get it into Obama's hands.
Well,
maybe McCain, I'm not sure, but I don't think so. But anyway, what I'm saying is that nobody knows this about what we're all about. And I've been doing this for 40 months, and I'm sure a lot of you have been at it many years. Charles, 30 years. Somehow, the message has to get to the politicians because they're the ones that make the decision, but they don't want to believe it because it's a bad subject. It loses votes.
Well, that's it. The message is a much tougher message than Daniel Yergin's message. Okay, so yeah, we need a great messenger. It would be great to have somebody with the dynamics of Barack Obama really just saying we got to address this problem, but he's not going to go very.
I was at a conference not too long ago, and T. Boone Pickens gave a talk, and I went up and introduced myself after the conference. I said, I have 3 questions for you. He said, what are they? I said, peak oil. He said, for real. I said, Daniel Yergin. He said, a big F liar. Matthew Simmons, the right guy. Well, so anyway, that's...
There you go, Matt. Hear, hear. Hear, hear. Absolutely. Absolutely. Well said, sir. Well said.
So anyway, we all have a challenge, and I'll tell you what, I'm prepared to do anything to make a difference, and I think all of us together can make Absolutely a difference. Right. And I'm going to try it through my Congress lady in Santa Barbara. I'm feeding her stuff. So we're going to change Washington. They call it something called lobbyists, I think, might be needed.
That's who you're fighting. No, just to respond to that, I think there always can be a public upswell. There always can be people getting out, talking about what's going on, educating each other. I mean, that's why we do what we do. We're all volunteers. But it requires a credibility. It requires facts. It requires a logic that isn't always out there in the pablum-infested press. It's just not.
But you have to face that we're failing. We are failures, and we have lost our chance because I believe much of the financial mess that's going on now is a result of peak energy, peak oil, whatever you want to say. Not all of it, but much of it. And we've now lost the possibility that we had 6 months ago of a bully pulpit.
Mm-hmm. I have a picture of Charlie every time. He's talked to me twice, and people have taken pictures. He points at me every time. I don't know. He's got this big-ass finger. Just, but yeah. It's scary. No. Oh, or time. Thank you all very much. What's that?
What do you believe Saudi Arabia's maximum daily production?